Welcome back to Chain Reaction, the Foreign Policy Research Institute's flagship network of podcast series examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping our world. Throughout the year, we'll be talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, defense and geopolitical issues in the Baltic states, as well as current and future national security challenges and opportunities in the technology and space sectors. Join us each month for
Bear Market Brief,
Behind the Front,
Baltic Ways,
Report in Short,
The Ties That Bind, NATO Allies in Action. New episodes are available each week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and most streaming services. To be the first to know about new releases, you can subscribe to FPRI's Insights newsletter. That's fprinsights.substack.com, or follow the link available in the description of this episode. Thanks for joining us. This week on the Bear Market Brief.
Here on the Bear Market Brief, we try not to get too technical or jargony, but given the issues we cover, sometimes we get pretty far into the weeds. As the year comes to a close, it raises an important question. If we zoom out, what actually happened in 2025? Well, I have a great guest to tell us about that. I'm Aaron Schwartzbaum, and this is the Bear Market Brief. On today's episode, we'll be talking to Sarah Ashbaugh. You may recognize that name because she is the current editor-in-chief of the Bear Market Brief newsletter. If you're somehow listening to this podcast but not subscribed to that news brief, you, my friend, have fallen through the cracks. I will include a link in the episode description. You should really be following along. It's a great source. I talked to Sarah and asked her for her high-level take on what are the plot lines that have really mattered in Russia this year relating to the war, to the economy, to politics. We also talked a little bit about process. How do you actually go about making a news brief? What makes a newsworthy story? A quick correction, because it matters to me. In this episode, I referred to Sarah as the third editor-in-chief of the Bear Market Brief. She's actually number 4. Stephanie Petrella did a great job as number 3. All right, that said, let's dive into the conversation. I hope you enjoy. Sarah, I would say welcome to the Bear Market Brief, but technically you're already here. So let me specify welcome to the Brief podcast. How are you doing today?
Hi, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Well, why don't, for folks who haven't heard your voice, in actual voice, not in writing, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are and what keeps you busy at FPRI with the Brief specifically?
Hi, well, my name is Sarah Ashbaugh, and I'm a research fellow at FPRI, focusing on Russian domestic politics and international relations. I am also the editor-in-chief of the Bear Market Brief, a weekly newsletter that explores Russian politics and economics and Ukraine that goes out every Friday.
So if you're not somehow listening to the podcast, but not also reading and following the brief, this is a great opportunity to sign up. It is a really great resource. And I'm not just saying that because once upon a time I founded and was editor-in-chief. We'll have a talk between editor-in-chief. So in this episode, really excited to talk through actual events, but also some process, like what it takes to put together a brief and compare some notes. So let's start with the big one, or maybe big 2 or 3. You've been in the weeds on news and probably a lot closer to following more concrete events than I've been over the last year. What has happened in Russia? What are the plots you've been following? So there's obviously big single stories, Trump, Putin, Anchorage, ceasefire negotiations, but what are the plot lines that have really kept you busy?
Great question. The war is always on the forefront of my mind because it influences nearly every other aspect of Russian news, politics, economics, culture. Related to the war, I'm particularly following Russia's efforts to disable Ukraine's energy infrastructure and vice versa, and also the evolution of drone warfare over the course of the war, because I think that speaks to modern warfare moving forward.
Yeah, so kind of a more strategic focus. So, I mean, let's pull some of these threads. I don't think we need to go into the specifics of attacks on power plants per se, or events on the front, but I do like the strategic question. So, for listeners who are not super buffs on drones, what evolution have you seen? What does that look like?
I think this is a great example of drone warfare on a scale that we haven't seen before. And I think we're watching in real time, particularly in Ukraine having to develop new weapons to fight Russia, a much larger, more well-equipped army. So that development of the new weapons and then the implementation of them on the battlefield, it's been really interesting to see how strategy has evolved based on the use of drones rather than more traditional military strategies.
Certainly, I know I've seen pictures. They have now like a lot of these drones guided by, what is it, like fiber optic cable, and it just looks like spider webs all over the battlefield, and it's like impossible to move around. So from a strategy angle, a lot of very interesting questions. What about, I'm going to pull yet another thread here. Anything more related to domestic events in Russia?
Yes, definitely. I have in particular been following the restriction of internet access in Russia. So that includes both the restriction of access to news sources from so-called undesirable organizations or foreign agents, and also the restriction of access to social media and communications websites like YouTube and WhatsApp and Instagram. I think that what's particularly interesting to me is Russia's efforts to build a quote unquote sovereign internet that's separate from the rest of the world, and watching how that's been cutting off the Russian people from both the news in the world and also just communicating with people abroad.
This is a fascinating topic to me. And I think one of these places we can really compare notes, because when I started this in 2016, which I'm now realizing was a decade ago, which makes me feel so old. And that's not a thing we need to discuss here on this episode. They were just beginning to harass, or Russian government was beginning to harass Google and Facebook. And there was talk about whether it would be even technically feasible for Russia to cut itself off from the global internet. So now we have most foreign social media banned. Can Russia twist the valve and cut off the pipe broadly now? Is that possible?
I think the conversation or the efforts are still very much ongoing. So it's still changing, and Russia is not cut off entirely, but you can certainly see that the Russian government has scaled up its efforts in that direction. And I think that's what concerns me the most.
All right. Next question. One of the funny things that I see in, it's not really the Russian news, it's the Western news particularly, is this, I've called it multiple times on this podcast, the boom bust cycle, where Putin and or Russia as a whole and or its military and or the economy are either powerhouses and unstoppable or about to collapse abjectly. And it's never in between. So since you read the news very closely, I was going to say, which is it? But no, what is your sense of like how Russia's economy is actually doing? It's the bread and butter of BMB. So probably worth touching on.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that it's somewhere in between. And what I mean by that is that there are still some bad economic indicators. Inflation is high. There continues to be a labor shortage from sending participants to the war and people fleeing from Russia. But there are also some positive indicators. The Central Bank of Russia has reduced the key rate at its last several Board of Governors meetings. I think the bottom line is that as long as the Russian government is willing to continue to pour money into the war economy, that's going to prop up certain sectors and certain industries. So we'll see if and when there's a ceasefire, how that will change economic outlooks. But right now, government spending is definitely the main driver of growth. So we'll see what happens after the war ends. I think that also another factor to consider is the exit of Western businesses and the forced pivot to Eastern markets, which has put stress on Russian exports and on the Russian railway system, which is something that we've covered frequently in the brief. And also, as our collaborator Andras Toth-Shifra often writes about, there's been big stress on regional budgets to keep up with costs. this might be the most sort of dangerous economic problem for the Kremlin, because we have seen over the past year the emergence of several local protest movements based on particularly regions' failures to keep up struggling infrastructure. So, altogether, I would say that the economy is not fantastic, but as long as it remains a war economy and as long as the government continues to spend on war-related industries, that's going to prop up many of the sectors.
So this is the question that really gets me thinking a lot. Can Russia, or Putin specifically, afford to end the war?
I think that's the million-dollar question, because the economy is so tied to war-related spending at this point, several years in, and it's going to be difficult both from a demographic standpoint with war participants returning to Russia, and also from an economic standpoint with several of these industries that are used to an influx of government spending to no longer have that.
I also wonder if the increasing divergence between the US and Europe, the US can invest, let's say sanctions are lifted, can invest in Russia in physical projects, but it's not going to provide consumer market or actual place Russia could sell stuff to, realistically, unlike Europe. So
that's a great point. And the US government, this current administration, has shown that they want to invest in Russia, and there are ongoing discussions about several investment projects collaborating economically with Russia. So we'll see how that turns out.
Also, huge risks, as putting my political risk hat on, huge risks to the companies involved, not what with the potential for political change in the US, but also a snapback in relations with Russia broadly. I mean, we could go back and forth a ton on some of the specifics of what rapprochement or change in policy could look like, but lots of angles there. All right, let's turn to another question that's going to date me significantly. Tell me about the kinds of sources you look at in producing the brief. I reckon it's a different list than when I used to do this.
Well, we'll see. I'll be interested to compare. I think that's a great question, because the sources that we use, I think, is an important part of what we add, what we give to our audiences in the brief, something that they may not be getting from other English language news sources is our reliance on Russian language media to build the brief and to understand what's going on in Russia. So for me, I like to check Russian language news outlets like Meduza, The Bell, Novaya Gazeta, Kommersant, the Moscow Times, those kinds of sources. That's where I go first to get a sense of what that media is reporting on. And then I like to compare that with Western media sources like BBC or Reuters or AP, and kind of compare contrast in what different media is focusing on. And I also like to keep an eye on Russian state media, even though it's not independent or necessarily reliable. I think it's important to understand what the Russian government is reporting, how it is maybe spinning some of these news stories, what angle it's taking, and what news the Russian people are getting on a daily basis.
The party line, in other words.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to my process. Kommersant was definitely still there. Meduza was still there. The Bell came together after my time, but is a great news source, and they publish in English. So folks, if you are looking to subscribe to a great news source, highly recommend that one. I used to lean on Vedomosti a lot, which I know got kind of neutered by the government and is less critical than it used to be. So yeah, interesting to hear how that's changed. Some familiar names, some less familiar names. Now, I'm sure. It sounds like you have a point.
I forgot to mention that I also do check social media sites. I think that's become an increasingly important way to understand what's going on the ground in Russia and Ukraine. Particularly Telegram has become a way to get news that I never used before, but now I tend to rely on.
Yeah, I'm some really good sources there for sure. Definitely not something I was doing in 2016. All right. So for listeners who are potentially more masochistically minded and are thinking, I want to start my very own Russia news brief. And we'd welcome you into the community with open arms, obviously.
Please do.
I guess we don't need to reveal every single detail, but no, how do you go about producing a weekly brief? Tell us about your process. You're reading the news. Yes, but like some of the more nitty gritty, like what are you actually doing to get this brief out on a given Friday?
Well, just keeping a constant pulse on the news, I think, is a big part of it because it's a lot easier to write about the background of some of these stories if you already know what's been going on the past few months and years. So consistently checking these sources and seeing how stories are evolving over time. For me, I try to have the most objective reporting possible. So checking multiple sources and verifying that this information is not only coming from one place, but is something that multiple people are finding or discovering or reporting on. And then it's always a process of summarizing and condensing and writing it in a bite-sized way that's easy to consume on a Friday afternoon so that our readers get an overview of what's happening. And they're always welcome to dig into the sources and get into the nitty-gritty. But I think one thing that's valuable about the brief is that it's brief and that it provides a summary and an overview of what's going on in Russia.
And that's, I mean, one of the hardest parts is the writing in brief. I mean, it's like the classic, like academic joke, like, oh, professor, I know you asked for a page, but I gave you 10. So, okay, what you're following the news. So like actual process, do you have like a Google Doc of like stories that like are warrant inclusion? Then you're going through on Friday and crossing ones out and deciding which are the good ones. What is a good story? Like what makes the light bulb over your head turn on as you gather news?
I do have a Google Doc, and sometimes I'm tracking stories over multiple weeks to see where it's going to go before I decide whether or not it's included in the brief in a given week. For me, because I focus mainly on politics and international relations, my light bulb goes off anytime I see either major news stories that are being reported on across different media outlets where a clear theme is emerging, or sometimes it's the opposite. It's that something is a more niche issue that other places aren't writing about, and I want to bring that to the attention of our readers. So I think that can go either way.
Yeah, fascinating. One other question. You've been doing this, like 2 or 3 years now by my counts? Longer?
Yeah, don't challenge me. Let's see. I think it's 3 years.
Well, congratulations to the longest serving editor-in-chief of the Bear Market Brief. There's been 3 of us, and you are undisputed champion in longevity. One of the fun things to think back on is, at least when I was like getting this off the ground, how many changes I got to make based on feedback and trial and error to the format, to the approach. Have you made any changes over the time you've been doing this, and what drove them?
Let's see. I've relied a lot on the tradition of the brief that I inherited from the previous editors-in-chief. I think that, what changes have I made? Something that we added is a summary of the news stories up top on the brief, and I thought that that was a really valuable way to see at a glance what's going on in all 3 or 4 of our major news stories for that week. It's nice to have that summary. And that's something that I also look back on to get a sense of how the news is evolving over time. My ability to consume and then summarize these major stories has also just improved over time. And so I think my ability to write about both my understanding of Russia's politics and economics and my ability to summarize it has improved as well. So that's not necessarily a change, but it is an evolution.
Do you find, because I definitely, back when I didn't speak a lot of Russian, understandably writing this, but my reading in Russian got really, really fast when I was doing this. Have you found the same thing?
Yes, exactly. My speaking skills are getting a little rusty, but my reading skills, it definitely keeps me current.
It was super funny because I remember like with friends, after like years of doing this, like Russian friends, like reading or like speaking with them, and like slang and that kind of joking around was just very atrophied and rusty, but then could like describe inflationary expectations because I was like reading that kind of stuff in vocab every single day. And it was just kind of funny. Speaking of one of the more fun aspects of this, there's been much that has changed in the brief since my time. One tradition that warms my heart every time I read a brief is the continuation of wordplay in the subject line, which is definitely my personal touch. So I wanted to ask, over your tenure, if you have any subject lines that you are most proud of, and please explain, and then I'll trade you for mine.
It's so funny you would ask about the subject lines because sometimes it's my favorite part and sometimes it's my least favorite part of getting the brief out every Friday, is trying to come up with something clever and hopefully funny occasionally to add as the subject line.
To note, I never mandated that anybody continue to do this. So this is Sarah's own volition, to note.
I think it's great. I think it's a great tradition, and it helps the brief stand out and gives it a little bit more levity and approachability, I think. So I've definitely enjoyed continuing that. My favorite subject lines, sometimes my favorite ones are the ones that are so obvious that they just write themselves. So I'm thinking about last summer, after Ukraine's Operation Spiderweb, we had a subject line, "Caught in the Spiderweb," which just fits so well and was so easy to write. Another favorite one of mine, a more recent one, was the lions, tigers, and paper bears subject line. That was in reference to President Trump called Russia a paper tiger, and Putin responded that Russia's not a tiger, Russia's a bear, and there are no paper bears. And so I just thought that was a really fun one. But I'm eager to hear your favorite subject line.
That's a good one. So the one caveat here is that when I was doing my best or my worst, depending on how you see it, I was not yet affiliated with a serious formal think tank, and so could really go ham. My process was, I was doing this daily at the time. It would usually be at like 5:45 or 6 a.m. be doing this. And had you been my roommate at the time, like you would have heard just some coffee brewing and then some clicking. And then usually at some point, A, from the fatigue, and B, from that moment of eureka, just maniacal cackling as I came up with the line. So my favorite one, there's maybe two, both music references. One was about a consumer credit bubble in the Tuva Republic. For those not intimately familiar, that's like right next to Mongolia, and they're famous for throat chanting. If you want to hear something really cool after this episode, go look up Tuvan throat chanting. Really neat. But there's a consumer credit bubble. That's actually a trend that has not ended in Russia. There's a lot of debt used to finance habits, especially these days with inflation and what have you. So it was driving a lot of demand in the region, just opportunity, but also risk popping, just serving as a block to any future development. So I sensed the subject line based on the classic hip hop song Get Low, Tuva window, Tuva wall. I got a couple of annoyed emails. Listeners, Sarah is shaking her head as I share that.
In appreciation, that's fantastic.
The other one I did more from the reference to Vietnam era music was questions around, and this is again, I guess, a topic that has continued, questions about the validity of Russian state data, so Rosstat, and some potential hijinks with the numbers, even dating back to before they were publishing this frequently, some methodological changes that were just a little funny. And so that subject line was "Stop Hey Rosstat Sound." That was a one that I remember, but there were, I was doing this daily for 2 years. There were so many that have kind of washed away at this point. But yeah, those two definitely stand out.
You must have gotten really good at it. Thinking of one every day would be a challenge.
It was, yeah, some days were definitely stretchier than others for sure. Well, that takes me to the end of my questions. It's been really nice to connect. And folks, again, I will leave a link to the brief in the description. You should already be subscribed, but we'll forgive you if you're not. This is a great day to sign up. And thanks again for joining, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Sarah and to you, listener, for joining. This is yet another reminder that you should be subscribed to the Bear Market Brief newsletter. So if you have a minute, click down in the episode description and sign up today. The Bear Market Brief podcast is a project of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, that's FPRI, a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia. For more information on this initiative and on many others, visit fpri.org. This marks the end of our 2025 season. I'm Aaron Schwartzbaum, signing off, wishing you and yours a wonderful holiday season.